The first detective who opened the evidence box thought the white powder on the black leather notebook was cocaine. It was flour. That discovery would have been almost funny if the notebook had not been recovered from the basement of an abandoned safe house belonging to Dominic Vale, a man federal prosecutors had spent 12 years trying to connect to half the organized crime in Chicago. The notebook was warped from water damage. Butter stains marked the corners. Several pages smelled faintly of vanilla. On the cover, written in rounded blue ink, were 4 ordinary words: Daniel's Beginner Baking Book. Detective Aaron Pierce stared at it for several seconds before opening the first page. Chocolate cake, lemon bars, cinnamon rolls. Someone had added comments in darker ink beside the recipes. Too much salt. Sophie says, stop murdering the dough. Buy better vanilla. Do not overmix when angry. Pierce nearly laughed. Then he reached page 37 and stopped. Numbers were written between the ingredients. Dates appeared beside oven temperatures. Names were hidden in descriptions of frosting consistency. And suddenly, the ridiculous little cookbook became one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in the city. 11 months earlier, Sophie Bell had no idea she was teaching a Mafia boss how to separate eggs. She only knew the quiet man in the back row was terrible at it. You have broken 4 yolks. The man looked down at the bowl. Sophie planted both hands on her hips. You're staring at them like they betrayed you. They did. They're eggs. They had one responsibility. Sophie tried not to smile. The evening class was held in the teaching kitchen of the Harrison Community Center, a brick building squeezed between a laundromat and a pharmacy on Chicago's northwest side. 12 students stood behind stainless steel counters dusted with flour. Daniel Voss, according to his registration card, attended every Thursday. He arrived exactly 7 minutes early. He wore dark trousers, clean white shirts, and expensive watches he seemed determined to hide beneath his sleeves. He rarely spoke. He never checked his phone during class, and for a man who looked capable of making a room nervous by simply entering it, he treated pastry dough with bizarre gentleness. Sophie walked closer. Separate another. Daniel cracked the egg. The yolk broke instantly. Sophie closed her eyes. A woman across the room laughed. Daniel looked genuinely offended. That did it. Sophie started laughing too. Not politely. The kind that made her shoulders shake. Daniel stared at her. Most people became quieter when he stared at them. Sophie only wiped flour from her cheek. I'm sorry. You don't look sorry. I'm trying. No, you aren't. Something shifted in his face. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was small, brief, but Sophie remembered it. Dominic remembered it too. People had smiled at him for years because they wanted something. Permission, money, protection, mercy. Sophie Bell laughed because he had lost a fight with an egg. He returned the following Thursday. And the Thursday after that. Dominic Vale had built his life around control. At 16, he had watched his father get shot in the front seat of a Cadillac and learned that grief was dangerous when other men could see it. At 23, he inherited enough of the Vale organization to become either a leader or a corpse. By 38, newspapers called him untouchable. They were wrong. Dominic had always known exactly where he could be touched. Her name had been Lucia. His younger sister had been 26 when cancer reduced her world from graduate school and terrible karaoke to a hospital room overlooking Lake Michigan. On her final birthday, she had asked Dominic for one thing, not diamonds, not another specialist, a homemade chocolate cake. He promised. Then business intervened. A shipment disappeared. 2 men defected. Dominic spent 18 hours dealing with consequences created by people who feared disappointing him more than they feared making mistakes. Lucia died the following morning. The bakery box Dominic had purchased instead sat unopened beside her hospital bed. He never ate chocolate cake again. For 11 years, every November 17th, Dominic entered the kitchen of whatever house he was living in, placed flour, eggs, butter, sugar, and chocolate on the counter, and attempted Lucia's cake. Every year, it failed, collapsed, burned, dry. Once, inexplicably, almost liquid. He never told anyone. His private ritual became the one failure he refused to delegate. Then one afternoon, his driver stopped outside Harrison Community Center because a road closure blocked their usual route. Dominic saw a poster through the window. The beginner baking no experience necessary. The following Thursday, Daniel Voss was born. Sophie assumed Daniel was an accountant. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because he disliked vague measurements. The first time she told the class to add a pinch of salt, he raised his hand. How much is a pinch? A pinch. That isn't a measurement. It is tonight. His mouth tightened. Sophie leaned toward him. Daniel, baking requires precision. People don't. His eyes stayed on hers longer than necessary. She did not know she had said the one sentence he would remember for months. Their routine formed quietly. Daniel carried the heavy ingredient boxes before class without being asked. Sophie saved the corner workstation for him because he hated people standing behind him. He brought coffee for himself. Then one evening arrived with a second cup. Oat milk, he said. Sophie took it. You remembered. You complained for 9 minutes last week. I discussed. You prosecuted. She smiled. He almost did. Sophie began looking forward to Thursdays. That irritated her. She had spent enough of her life becoming comfortable with being the funny woman, the dependable woman, the woman people called when their wedding cake collapsed, or their boyfriend left, or their mother needed a fundraiser organized. At 31, she had learned that being loved for warmth could feel dangerously similar to being used for warmth. Daniel never asked her to entertain him. He seemed to enjoy silence. Sometimes after class, they cleaned together without speaking. For Sophie, that became more intimate than flirting. Then the community center lost its city grant. Sophie received the notice on a Tuesday morning. Without the funding, the teaching kitchen would close within 6 weeks. By Thursday, she had already designed 3 fundraising plans. Daniel noticed something was wrong while she demonstrated buttercream. You're whipping that too hard. Sophie stopped. Excuse me? You told Rachel last month people overbeat frosting when they're angry. The class went quiet. Sophie stared at him. You listen? I paid for the class. She laughed despite herself. Later, while washing bowls, Sophie told him the kitchen might close. Daniel's hands became still beneath the running water. How much? She looked over. To keep it open. Yes. About 80,000 through next year. That's all? Sophie snorted. Accountants must be doing wonderfully. His expression changed. Don't. What? Don't joke because you're afraid. That landed harder than she expected. Sophie turned off the faucet. You don't get to analyze me because you finally learn not to destroy meringue. Dominic lowered his eyes. You're right. She expected defensiveness. Instead, he dried the bowl. I'm sorry. The apology disarmed her. 2 days later, an anonymous donor offered the community center $100,000. Sophie declined it. Dominic found out the next Thursday. He had never been refused anonymously before. You declined? There were conditions. What conditions? The donor wanted financial control over the program. Dominic frowned. That sounds responsible. It sounds like ownership. You need the money. I need a kitchen. I don't need a stranger buying the right to decide who belongs in it. Dominic stared at the bread dough beneath his hands. Sophie softened. This place works because people don't have to prove they deserve to be here. His fingers stopped. For most of his life, Dominic had controlled everything he protected. businesses, people, territory. Sophie was telling him protection without freedom was simply another form of possession. He withdrew the offer the next morning. Then he quietly hired an independent non-profit attorney to restructure the donation with no control, no naming rights, and no conditions. Sophie accepted it 2 weeks later. She never knew. That might have remained their entire relationship. Coffee, flour, unfinished conversations, if Dominic had not made a birthday cake. November 17th arrived cold and rainy. Dominic spent the day in meetings while Lucia lived like a ghost behind his ribs. At 6:30, he dismissed everyone. At 7:15, he drove himself to Harrison Community Center. Sophie was locking the front doors. She looked surprised. "Daniel, I need the kitchen. We don't have class." "I know." She studied him. Something in his face stopped her questions. 20 minutes later, they stood alone beneath fluorescent lights. Sophie watched him measure cocoa. "Who is it for?" Dominic said nothing. She did not ask again. That was one of the things he had begun trusting about her. She knew when silence needed protection. He made the cake himself. Sophie only corrected his temperature once. When one layer cracked, Dominic went completely still. Sophie saw his breathing change. Not anger, fear. She moved beside him. "We can fix that." "No." "Yes." "It's broken. It's cake." He looked at her. Sophie picked up the cracked layer. Ganache. She spread chocolate across the break and placed the second layer over it. "The crack is still there," Dominic said. "Of course, you didn't fix it. I made it strong enough to hold." For several seconds, he could not speak. They finished near midnight. The cake was imperfect. The frosting leaned slightly to one side. Sophie lit a single candle. Dominic's face changed. "Don't." She immediately blew it out. He gripped the edge of the counter. "My sister asked me to bake for her." Sophie stayed quiet. "I didn't." Past tense told her enough. "When?" 11 years ago. The room felt smaller. I told her I would come back." Sophie looked at the cake. "And tonight?" "Tonight I finally did." She wanted to touch him. Instead, she rested her hand on the counter between them. After several seconds, Dominic placed his hand beside hers. Not touching. Close. It was more intimate than either was ready to admit. Then headlights swept across the kitchen windows. 3 black SUVs stopped outside. Dominic's entire body changed. Sophie saw it happen. The shoulders, the eyes, the stillness. The man she knew disappeared without moving. 4 men in dark coats entered. The first one addressed him with 2 words. "Mr. Vale." Sophie felt the room tilt. Dominic turned toward her. "Sophie." She backed away. He had never told her his real name, but she knew Dominic Vale. Everyone in Chicago knew Dominic Vale. Federal investigations. Restaurants burned after refusing protection. Businessmen disappearing. Photographs taken outside courthouses. She looked from him to the armed security detail, waiting near the door. "You're him." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Yes." The cake sat between them. Ridiculous. Beautiful. Terrible. Sophie pulled off her apron. "How long?" "Since the beginning." Her eyes burned. "You sat here every Thursday and lied to me. My name was the lie." "That's not how lying works." One of Dominic's men stepped forward. "We need to leave." Dominic did not look away from Sophie. "Why?" The question came out quieter than she intended. "Why baking?" He glanced toward the cake. She understood, and somehow that made it worse. Because the grief had been real. The coffee had been real. His ridiculous hatred of separating eggs had been real, which meant she could not dismiss everything as manipulation. Dominic left without touching the cake. Sophie remained in the kitchen until 1 in the morning. Then she wrapped it carefully and placed it in the refrigerator. She hated herself for doing that. 3 days later, someone broke into her apartment. Nothing valuable disappeared. The television remained. Her laptop remained. jewelry untouched. Only one item was missing: Daniel's beginner baking book. Sophie called the police. Then she called the number Dominic had written on the back of an old class registration card. He answered before the second ring. "Are you hurt?" No hello. No explanation. Sophie's anger sharpened. "Someone entered my apartment." Silence. What did they take? The recipe book. Another silence. Different this time. Dangerous. "Leave your apartment." "Why?" "Now, Dominic." "Sophie, take your coat and walk downstairs." She heard movement on his end. "What is in that book?" His pause answered before his words did. "Something that has nothing to do with you." That stopped being true when someone entered my home. 10 minutes later, Dominic arrived. No convoy. No visible guards. He entered the apartment and inspected every room himself. Sophie watched from the doorway. "You used my recipe book." "Yes." "For what?" Dominic faced her. "For remembering things I couldn't safely write anywhere else." "Criminal things?" "Some." Her stomach turned. "You put me in danger." "Yes." He did not soften it, did not excuse it. Sophie appreciated that almost as much as she hated him for it. "What exactly did they steal?" "A copy." She blinked. "A copy? The real one is elsewhere." "Where?" Dominic looked toward her. Sophie suddenly understood. "No." He said nothing. "No, Dominic. You wrote the recipes. So no one in my organization ever considered that you might have another copy." Sophie laughed once, without humor. "You hid Mafia evidence in baking instructions because criminals don't respect hobbies." Essentially. She stared at him. "That might be the most insulting thing I've ever heard. It has kept you alive. Until now." That silenced him. For the first time, Sophie saw fear in Dominic Vale. Not fear of prosecution. Not fear of enemies. Fear that his choices had reached someone he cared about. He took her to a safe house that night. It was an old 3-story brownstone in Lincoln Park, elegantly furnished and emotionally empty. Sophie walked into the kitchen. There, inside a drawer, she found measuring spoons labeled in her handwriting. A printed recipe from class. The ugly oven mitt she had given him after he burned his palm. "You live here?" "Sometimes." She opened a cabinet. "Flour, sugar, chocolate, vanilla." "You actually practiced." Dominic leaned against the doorway. "You said repetition matters." Sophie looked at him. "What else did I say that you turned into criminal strategy?" His mouth almost moved. She hated that she noticed. Over the next 2 days, Sophie learned enough to become terrified. Dominic had been collecting evidence against Victor Soren, the man who had served as his father's closest advisor and later became Dominic's mentor. Soren had spent decades turning legitimate businesses into pipelines for extortion and laundering. Dominic had participated. He did not pretend otherwise. But when Soren ordered the bombing of a restaurant whose owner had refused cooperation, killing 2 employees, Dominic drew the moral boundary he had spent years convincing himself he still possessed. No children, no civilians, no punishment of families. Soren called those rules sentimental. Dominic began preparing to destroy him. The recipe book contained transaction dates, coded account references, and names of officials on Soren's payroll. Sophie listened, then asked the question no prosecutor apparently had. "Why didn't you leave?" Dominic looked toward the window. "People who leave organizations like mine create vacancies. And vacancies are filled by worse men." "That sounds convenient." His eyes hardened. Sophie did not retreat. "You get to stay powerful, while telling yourself power keeps everyone safe. You know nothing about my world. I know kitchens." He stared at her. "When one chef refuses to train anyone because he believes only he can run the line, everything collapses when he disappears. This isn't a restaurant." "No. Restaurants have health inspectors. Against all logic." Dominic laughed. Sophie smiled, before remembering she was furious with him. The moment vanished. That evening, Dominic discovered the stolen notebook had been deliberately allowed to reach police. Soren wanted authorities to find the coded pages. Not enough to convict anyone. Enough to make Dominic look like an informant. His own captains would turn on him. Sophie saw the pattern first. He wants you isolated. Dominic looked at the photographs spread across the dining table. He wants me dead. No. She pointed toward the notebook. If he wanted you dead, why involve me? Dominic's expression changed. Sophie continued. He wants you scared enough to come back to him. Soren had raised Dominic after his father died. Taught him discipline, strategy, violence. He had built Dominic into something efficient, and then spent 20 years reminding him that the world outside their organization would never forgive what he was. Soren was not simply protecting power. He was protecting his greatest creation. Dominic sat slowly. Sophie understood before he admitted it. He loves you. Dominic's face became unreadable. In his way, she added. That does not make him safe. No. She looked toward him. But it explains why he hasn't killed you. The attack came the next morning. Not gunfire. Fire. Someone torched the Harrison Community Center. Dominic arrived while firefighters were still breaking windows. Sophie stood behind the barricade in borrowed sweatpants, staring at smoke pouring from the teaching kitchen. Her kitchen. Her students' photographs. The shelves of handwritten recipes. Dominic approached. She turned and struck him across the chest with both hands. Not because she thought she could hurt him, because something inside her had nowhere else to go. You brought this to me. I know. You brought this to them. I know. He let her hit him again. Then Sophie stopped. Dominic's hands remained at his sides. She looked at the burning building. What are you going to do? His answer was immediate. End it. That frightened her more than the fire. She grabbed his coat. No. Dominic looked down. You don't get to turn grief into permission. His face changed. You told me you learned because you failed your sister. Sophie, you think dying violently fixes that? I'm not planning to die. You're planning like a man who doesn't care if he does. He had no answer. Sophie released him, then learned something new. That night, Dominic made the decision that destroyed Dominic Vale. He contacted federal prosecutors. Not anonymously. Not through attorneys. Personally. He offered financial records, names, locations, recordings, and testimony. Everything, including evidence against himself. His empire would collapse. Properties would be seized. Men who had served him for decades would call him traitor. His freedom was no longer guaranteed. The only condition he requested was protection for Sophie, her students, and every civilian connected to the community center. The prosecutor asked why they should trust him. Dominic placed Lucia's corrected chocolate cake recipe on the table. Because I'm finished asking the wrong people to forgive me. Soren learned about the meeting within hours. He abducted Sophie the following evening. She woke inside the abandoned Vale family bakery on Taylor Street, a business Dominic's mother had owned before his father turned the property into a meeting place. Soren sat across from her. He was 70, elegant, tired, and far gentler than Sophie expected. You changed him. Sophie studied him. No. Soren smiled. They always say that. He was already changing. That's why he found my class. The smile disappeared. You think you understand him because he learned to bake a cake? No. I think you misunderstand him because you taught him everything except how to live without you. Soren's expression tightened. Sophie's hands trembled beneath the table. She kept her voice steady. Emotional intelligence was not the absence of fear. It was knowing fear did not deserve every decision. He won't come, she said. Soren looked toward the door. He always comes. And Dominic did. Rain ran from his black coat as he entered the ruined bakery alone. Soren had men positioned in the shadows. Dominic knew. He looked only at Sophie. "You okay?" She nodded. "Soren Sahil. You see? Always the rescuer." Dominic finally faced him. "No?" Something in his voice changed the room. "I came to tell you it's over." Soren laughed softly. "You would destroy everything your father built for her?" Dominic looked at Sophie, then at the walls where his mother had once sold bread before violence swallowed the family. "No." He turned back. "I destroyed it because I finally understood what it built me into." Soren's eyes hardened. "You ungrateful boy." For one instant, Dominic was 16 again. Father dead, hands bloody. Soren offering him certainty. Then Sophie said quietly, "Dominic, one word. Not command. Not rescue. Arminda." Precision mattered in baking. People did not have to be precise. Dominic exhaled. Police sirens sounded outside. Soren's men moved. Then half of them lowered their weapons. Dominic had spent the previous 24 hours giving every member of his organization a choice. Walk away and cooperate, or fall with Soren. The old man stared around the bakery as the empire he believed belonged to him dissolved through decisions he could no longer control. He reached for a gun. Dominic stepped between him and Sophie. A shot cracked through the building. Soren fell. Not from Dominic's weapon. One of his own longtime guards had fired after seeing him aim towards Sophie. Dominic stood motionless. He could have crossed the room, could have finished the man who had controlled his life for 22 years. Instead, Dominic kicked the gun away and called for an ambulance. That choice became the final evidence Sophie needed that Daniel had never been entirely imaginary. 4 months later, Dominic Vale pleaded guilty to conspiracy, financial crimes, and obstruction charges. His cooperation dismantled Soren's network across 3 states. Several violent charges prosecutors had once suspected could not be proven, but Dominic did not pretend innocence. He forfeited nearly everything: homes, cars, businesses, accounts. The Vale name itself became something he could no longer use as armor. Because of the scope of his cooperation and evidence proving he had prevented multiple planned attacks, Dominic received a reduced sentence far below what newspapers predicted. Sophie attended the hearing. She sat in the final row. When Dominic turned before marshals led him away, he saw her. She lifted one hand. Not goodbye, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. He nodded. 18 months later, Detective Aaron Pierce walked into the newly reopened Harrison Community Kitchen carrying an evidence box. Sophie looked up from a tray of cinnamon rolls. "You're early." Pierce placed the old recipe book on the counter. "Case is closed." She stared at it. Daniel's beginner baking book. Edges burned, pages stained, still intact. "Thought you might want this back." Sophie ran her thumb across the cover. "Most expensive cookbook in Chicago. Federal government disagrees. They valued it at 14 criminal convictions." She laughed. After Pierce left, Sophie opened the notebook. Most pages were exactly as she remembered. Then she found the final page. A recipe had been written there in Dominic's handwriting before the book entered evidence. Lucia's chocolate cake. Below it, one sentence. "Cracks are allowed. Make it strong enough to hold." Sophie closed the book because suddenly she could not see clearly. 3 months after that, on a grey Tuesday morning, the bell above the community kitchen door rang. Sophie was arguing with a supplier over the price of butter. "We order £40 a week, Greg. At this point I should own part of the cow." The person standing in the doorway laughed. Sophie stopped. Dominic looked different. Thinner. No bespoke suit. Dark jeans. A charcoal coat. Ordinary shoes. No watch. No men behind him. No armored car outside. He held a paper grocery bag. Sophie ended the call. Neither moved. Finally, she glanced toward the bag. "What's that?" "Eggs." She raised an eyebrow. "Brave. I've improved." That sounds unlikely. Dominic stepped closer. The space between them held lies, danger, anger, 18 months of letters, and dozens of conversations neither had been allowed to finish. He placed the groceries on the counter. I don't have much anymore. Sophie looked at him. I know. I'm working with an accounting firm that apparently believes former organized crime figures are excellent at fraud detection. That is depressingly logical. His mouth curved. I have a small apartment. Does it have a kitchen? Yes. Then you're showing off. The silence afterward became softer. Dominic looked toward the rebuilt room. Children from an afternoon program had painted tiny cakes along one wall. His anonymous donation had disappeared with his forfeited assets, but after the trial, dozens of neighborhood businesses had funded the reconstruction themselves. Sophie had refused to name the building after anyone. I thought about coming sooner, Dominic said. You weren't allowed. I mean, before everything. She understood. Before the lies became dangerous. Before fire. Before courtrooms. Before sacrifice. Sophie leaned against the counter. You probably would have ruined it. I know. That's growth. He looked at her. I don't expect anything. Good. I just wanted to see you. That part, I believe. Dominic's shoulders relaxed slightly. Sophie opened the grocery bag. Flour, butter, chocolate, vanilla, eggs. She looked up. What day is it? November 17th. Her expression softened. Dominic swallowed. I thought I might try again. Sophie pulled 2 aprons from beneath the counter. She handed him the ugly old one she had given him years earlier. He stared at it. You kept this? You have very few possessions. I felt guilty throwing one away. He smiled. This time, it stayed. They began without ceremony. Dominic measured. Sophie watched. He separated the first egg perfectly. She narrowed her eyes. Prison kitchen? 6 months. You practiced. Every week. The second egg broke. Sophie burst out laughing. Dominic looked at the ruined yolk. Unbelievable. She laughed harder. He started laughing too. It was the strangest sound in the rebuilt kitchen. A man once feared across Chicago, standing beneath paper decorations with flour on his coat, losing another fight with an egg. They baked until afternoon light warmed the windows. The cake emerged slightly uneven. One layer cracked down the center. Dominic stared at it. Sophie said nothing. He reached for the ganache himself. Carefully, he filled the crack. Then he looked at her. Strong enough to hold? Sophie stepped beside him. Their shoulders touched. Yeah, neither moved away. Outside, children began arriving for class. Inside, the old evidence book rested on a shelf between cookbooks donated by neighbors. The pages that once helped dismantle an empire now held nothing more dangerous than chocolate fingerprints and notes about oven temperatures. Dominic cut 2 slices. He placed one on a plate for Sophie. The other remained untouched. For Lucia. Sophie understood, without asking. Then Dominic reached for her hand. He hesitated before touching it, giving her every chance to move away. She did not. His fingers closed gently around hers. For most of his life, Dominic Vale had believed love meant protecting something so completely that no one else could reach it. Sophie had taught him something harder. Sometimes love meant standing beside someone without owning their choices. Sometimes it meant telling the truth even when the truth cost everything. Sometimes it meant accepting that a crack did not disappear simply because you covered it. And sometimes, on a cold November afternoon in Chicago, redemption looked less like being forgiven and more like a ruined man learning to make a birthday cake properly. Sophie took the first bite. She considered it carefully. Dominic waited. Well? She looked at him with a perfectly serious expression. Too much salt. His face fell. Then she smiled. He knew immediately. You're lying, maybe. Sophie. She laughed and handed him the fork. Dominic tasted the cake. For the first time in 11 years, November 17th, did not feel like the anniversary of a promise he had broken. It felt like proof that he could still keep the next one.